Something walks whistling past my house every night at 3:03. Every night, no matter the weather, something walks down our street whistling softly. You can only hear it if you're in the living room or the kitchen when they walk by, and it always starts at exactly 3:03. The sound starts faint, somewhere near the beginning of the lane near the Carson place. We're towards the middle of the street, so the whistling moves past us before fading away in the direction of the cul-de-sac. When I was younger, my sister and I would sneak into the kitchen some nights to listen. Mom and Dad didn't like that, and we'd catch hell if they found us out there, but they were never too hard on us, since we always stuck to the one big rule. Don't try to look at whatever was whistling. My neighborhood is a funny place. I've lived here since I was 6, and I love it. The houses are small but well kept, good-sized yards, plenty of places to roam. There are a lot of other kids here my age. I turned 13 back in October. We grew up together and would always play foursquare in the cul-de-sac, or roam around from back porch to back porch in the summer. This was a good place to grow up. I'm old enough to see it. And there's only the two strange things here, the night whistling and the good luck. The whistling never bothered me much. Like I said, I couldn't even hear it from my bedroom. But Mom and Dad don't like talking about it, so I've stopped asking questions. My dad is a strong guy, tall and calm. He has an accent since he moved to the US as a kid. His family, my grandparents, they're from the islands. That's what they call it. My dad, the only time he isn't so calm is if the whistler comes up. He talks a little quicker then, eyes move faster, and he tells us not to think about it so much and to always remember the one rule, the big rule. Don't try to look outside when the whistler goes past. Not that we could look even if we wanted. See, there are shutters on the inside of every window, thick pieces of heavy canvas that pull down from the top and latch to the bottom of the window frame. Each latch even has a small lock, about the size of what you'd find on a diary. My dad locks those shutters every night before we all go to bed and keeps the key in his room. My mom, I don't know what she thinks about the whistling. I've seen her out in the living room before at 3:03 when the sound starts. I could see her if I cracked my door open just an inch to peek. She's not out there often, at least I haven't caught her much. But once or twice a month I think she sits out there on our big red couch just listening. The whistler has the same tune every night. It's cheerful. Da-da-da-da-da-dum. Da-da-da-da-da-dum. Remember how I said there are two odd things about where I live? Well, besides our night whistler, everyone in my neighborhood is really lucky. It's hard to explain, and Dad doesn't like us talking about this part much either, but good things just seem to happen to people around here a lot. Usually it's small things, winning a radio contest, or getting an unexpected promotion at work, or finding some arrowheads buried in the yard. You know, the authentic kind. The weather is pretty good and there's no crime and everybody's gardens bloom extra bright in the fall. A million little blessings, I've heard my mom say about living here. But the main reason we stay here, why we moved here in the first place, is my sister Nola. She was born very sick, something with her lungs. We couldn't even bring her home when she was born, only visit her in the hospital. She was so small, I remember, small even compared to the other babies. A machine had to breathe for her. We moved into our house here to be closer to the hospital. As soon as we moved here, Nola started getting better. The doctors couldn't figure it out. They chalked it up to whatever they were doing, but we all could tell they were confused. But my parents knew, even I knew, Nola getting better was just another of the million little blessings we got for living in our neighborhood. So that's why we stayed even after we found out that for every small miracle that happens here every day, now and then, some bad things happened, but they only happen if you look for the whistler. See, our neighborhood has a welcoming committee. They show up with macaroni casserole and a gift basket and a manila folder whenever someone new moves in. They're very friendly. 4 people showed up when we moved in 7 years ago. The committee made small talk, gave me a Snickers bar, and took turns holding Nola. It was her first week out of the hospital, so they were extra careful. Then the committee asked to speak to my parents in private, so I was sent to my room where I still managed to hear nearly every word. The welcoming committee told my parents about how nice the neighborhood was. Really exceptionally, hard to explain kind of nice. And then they told my parents about the even harder to explain whistling that happened every morning at 3:03 and ended at the tick of 3:05. The group, our new neighbors, warned my parents that the whistling was quiet, would never harm or hurt us, as long as we didn't look for what was making the sound. This part they stressed, and I pushed my ear into the door, straining to hear them. People who went looking for the whistler had their luck change, sometimes tragically. A black cloud would hang over anyone that looked. Anything that could go wrong would. The manila envelope the committee brought over contained newspaper clippings, stories about car crashes and ruined lives, public deaths and freak accidents. Not everyone dies, I heard the head of the committee tell my dad. But the life goes out of them. Even if they live, there's no light in them ever again, no presence. My mom, I could tell she wasn't taking it seriously. She kept asking if this was some prank they play on new neighbors. At one point, my mom got angry, accused the committee of trying to scare us out of our new home, asked them if they were racist on account of my dad being from the islands. My dad calmed her down, told her he could tell our new neighbors were sincere and they were just trying to help us. He explained that he grew up hearing these kinds of stories from his mom and that he knew there were strange things that walked among us. Some of those strange things were good and some were bad, but most were just different. After the committee left, Dad went out to the hardware store, bought the canvas blinds, the latches, and the locks, and installed them on every window in the house after dinner. That first night in our new house, I crept out of my room at 3 a.m., only to find my dad awake sitting on the living room couch, holding my baby sister. My dad held up his finger in a shh motion, but patted the couch next to him. I sat, and we waited. At exactly 3:03, we heard the whistling. Da-da-da-da-da-dum. Da-da-da-da-da-dum. It came and it went, just like our neighbors said. The whistling returns each night, and we never look, and we enjoy our million little blessings every day. Nola breathes on her own, and she's grown into a strong, clever girl. My dad even joined the welcoming committee. We don't get new neighbors often. Why would anyone want to leave? But when a new family moves in, my dad and the committee bring them macaroni casserole, a gift basket, and the manila folder. I can always tell by the look on my dad's face when he comes back if the family took the committee seriously, or if we'd be getting new neighbors again very soon. Not long ago, a family moved in directly next to us. The previous owner, Ms. Maddie, passed away at age 105. She'd lived a good, long life. Our new neighbors seemed like they'd fit in just fine. They believed the welcoming committee, took my dad's advice about the locking shutters since they had a young child of their own. Whatever newspaper clippings were in that manila envelope, whatever evidence, my dad never let us see. But I imagine it must have been awfully convincing since our neighbors got along with no issues for the first month. One night, when our new neighbors had to leave town, they sent their son, Holden, to stay with us. He was 12, a year under me in school. I didn't know him well before that night, but as soon as his parents dropped him off after dinner, I could tell it was going to be a bad time. "Do you know who is always out there whistling every night?" Holden asked the moment the adults left the room. The 3 of us were sitting in the den, some Disney movie playing idly on the television. My sister and I exchanged a glance. "We don't talk about that," I said. "I think it's that weirdo that lives in the big yellow house on the corner," Holden said. "Mr. Tolles?" my sister asked. "No way, he's really nice." Holden shrugged. "Must be a psycho killer then." Nola tensed. We don't talk about it, I repeated. Let's go in my room and play Nintendo. We spent the next few hours playing games, eating popcorn, and then watching movies. A typical sleepover, but I could see Holden was getting antsy. After my parents had wished us a good night, locked the blinds, and gone to bed, Holden stood up from his beanbag and walked over to where Nola and I were sitting on my bed. "Have you ever even tried looking?" he asked. "It's nearly time." Like most sleepovers, we'd conveniently ignored any suggestion of a bedtime. I was shocked to see he was right. It was almost 3 a.m. I sighed. "We don't... See? I can't. I can't even try to look because my dad locks the blinds every night and hides the key," he continued, ignoring me. "So does our dad," said Nola. "No," replied Holden. "No, he doesn't." "You saw him do it," I said, a little sharper than I meant to sound. Holden grinned. "Your dad locks the blinds, yeah, but he doesn't hide the key. He keeps it right on his normal keychain." "So?" I asked, worried I already knew what he would say next, because I had noticed that my dad didn't bother hiding the key anymore after all of these years, because he knew we took it seriously. "So after your dad locked up, but before your parents went to bed, I went to the bathroom, and on my way, I may have peeked into their room, and I may have seen your dad's keychain on his nightstand, and I maybe went and borrowed the key to blinds." Nola and I stared, and his grin only grew wider. "You're lying," I said. Holden shrugged. "You can check if you want. Just open your parents' door and look. You'll see his keychain right there on the nightstand." "Stay here," I told both of them. "Don't move a muscle." I hurried over to my parents' room but hesitated at the door. If Holden wasn't lying, my dad would be angry, beyond angry. I was scared thinking about it, but more scared of an open window with the Whistler right outside. I opened the door, barely an inch, and looked in, but it was too dark to see. Taking a deep breath, I walked into the room. 2 steps into the dark, I froze. The whistling started, and I could hear it clearly from my parents' room. I never realized, but they must have heard the sound every night since we moved into the house. They never told us. I don't think I could have slept through it. I stood there, listening to the whistling come closer, unsure whether I should turn on a light or call out for my dad. Soft sounds from the living room brought me back to reality. "Nola!" I yelled, running out of my parents' room. Holden and Nola were standing near the front door next to a window. Holden wasn't lying. I could see him fumbling with the lock on one of the blinds. I heard a click. He did have the key. Holden let out a quick laugh. Nola stood next to him, hunched up, afraid but maybe curious. The whistling was right outside our house now. I think I made a sound, called out. I can't remember. Time felt frozen, clock hands nailed to the face. But I found myself moving. I'm not fast. I've never been athletic. Somehow, though, I covered the space between myself and Nola in a moment. My eyes were locked on her, but I heard Holden pull the blind all the way down so it could release. I heard the snap of it start to raise, and I heard the whistling just on the other side of the window. But I had my arms around Nola, and I turned us so she was facing away from the window. At the same time, I jammed my eyes shut. The blind whipped open. The whistling stopped. I felt Nola shaking in my arms. "Don't look, okay?" I told her. "Don't turn around." We were positioned so that she was facing back towards the hallway, and I was facing the window. My eyes were still closed. I felt her nod into my shoulder. I reached out with the arm not holding Nola and tried to touch Holden. My hand brushed against his arm. He was shaking worse than Nola. "Holden?" I asked. Silence. I reached past him and gingerly felt for the window, eyes still sealed shut. The glass was cold against my fingertips. colder than it should have been for the time of year. I moved my hand up the window, searching for the string to the blind. The glass began to get warmer the further I reached, and there was a gentle hum feeding back into my fingertips. I tried not to think about what might be on the other side of the window. Finally, I touched the string and yanked the blinds shut. I opened my eyes. In the dim light leaking out from the kitchen, I could make out Holden, pale and small, staring at the now closed window. "Holden?" I asked again. He turned towards me and he screamed. Everything became a flurry of motion. Lights sparked to life in the hall, then the living room. My parents' footsteps thudded across the hardwood floor. I didn't turn to look back at them. My eyes were glued to Holden. He was pale, had bit his lip so hard there was a thin red line of blood running down his chin, and he'd wet himself. "What happened?" my dad asked from behind me. I managed to swivel away from Holden and look back. He looked. I'd never seen my dad scared before, but I saw it that night. In that moment, an old, ugly terror stitched on his face. A parent's fear. "Just Holden?" he mouthed to me. I nodded yes. My dad let out a breath. He looked so relieved I nearly expected him to cheer. But then he turned to Holden and my dad's face changed. I wondered if he felt bad for feeling good that Holden was the only one that looked. There was a knock at the door. We all froze. Holden whimpered. "Don't answer it," my mom said. She stood at the threshold of the hall. I'd always thought she was a skeptic and just humored my dad about the windows and the whistler, but that night, we were all believers. I noticed that both of my parents held baseball bats they must have taken from their bedroom. The knock came again, a little louder this time. "Please don't open the door," Holden whispered. My dad walked over to him, hugged him close. "We won't," my dad promised, still holding his bat. "Nothing is coming in here tonight." Thud, thud, thud. This time the knocking was loud enough to rattle the door. Holden screamed again and Nola clutched her arms around my neck. My mom came over and knelt down next to us, wrapping my sister and me close. Thud, thud, thud. "Call the police," my mom whispered to my dad. The knocking instantly stopped. My dad looked over his shoulder at us. "Do you think—" He was cut off by frantic knocking that trailed off to a polite tap, tap, tap. "Police!" something said from the other side of the door. The voice from outside sounded exactly like my mom, like a parrot repeating the words back to her. "Police, call, the police. Tap, 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 police." My mom pulled us closer. "Police, police, police, police. Please stop," I heard her whisper. "I don't think calling them will help," my dad said. "How will we know when they're the ones at the door?" The knocking came back harder than before. The door shook. Then it stopped. After a long moment, I heard the knocking again, but it was coming from our back door. We all turned together towards the back door, but the knocking immediately returned to the front door. Front to back to front, loud then quiet, then loud again. Suddenly, the sound was coming from both doors at once. Big, heavy blows like a sledgehammer. Then something started rapping against all of the windows in the house. Then the walls. It was like we were living inside a drum with a dozen people trying to play at once. Or we were a turtle and something was attempting to claw us out of our shell. "Stop!" Holden yelled. The knocking died. "I won't tell," Holden said, staring at the door. "I promise I won't tell anyone what I saw. Just please go away." We waited for nearly a minute. Then we heard it. A soft tap, tap, tap coming from the window Holden had looked through earlier. Holden started to cry, sobbing like a prisoner watching gallows being built outside their cell. My dad held him, brushed his hair but never lied to him, never told him things would be okay. The tapping at the window went on for the rest of the night. We huddled together in the living room for I don't know how long, Eventually, my mom tried to take us kids into my room while my dad stayed to watch the door. But the second we moved into my bedroom, the knocking came back, so loud it was possible to ignore. I was afraid the door couldn't take it. We went back to the living room and the knocking stopped. Only the tap, tap, tap on the window remained. None of us slept that night. The tapping stopped around 7 a.m. That's about the time the sun comes up here. We waited another 2 hours before my dad opened the blinds from one window. He made us all go back to my parents' bedroom first. I heard him open the door, then come back in. "Okay," he told us. "It's done." Holden's parents came back around lunchtime. My mom and dad walked Holden over to his house, and they all went inside for quite a while. Nola and I watched from the window. She stuck to me the whole day, right at my side, sometimes holding my hand. When my parents came back, they looked grim, but wouldn't tell us what they said to Holden's family. It was a Sunday, so we all spent the day together, ordered pizza, and watched movies. That night, everyone slept in my room. Nola and my mom in the bed with me. My dad in a chair he'd pulled over. There was no knocking that night or any night since. We didn't see much of Holden or his parents for the rest of that week, but by Thursday there was a moving truck in their driveway. Nola and I watched them packing up the whole afternoon after school. What sticks with me most is how tired Holden and his parents looked. All three had the same pallor, grim mouths, and lightless eyes. Even from across the street I could tell something was very wrong. Holden and his family were gone before sunset. I remember what the original welcoming committee said to my parents when we moved in. "Not everyone who looks at the Whistler dies, but even those that live have the light go out of them, and the rest of their lives are full of misfortune. A million little tragedies." I think Holden's parents must have looked, either to comfort him if they didn't believe or share the burden if they did. I watch Nola some days, happy and young and alive, and I wonder if I'd been slower, if she'd looked out the window that night. Would I have looked too, to comfort her, to share that burden? I'm glad I don't have to find out. We still live in that house, in that neighborhood. We still hear our Whistler walking past every night. The blessings, the luck, the good things here are too good to leave. But we're careful. We don't have friends over to spend the night anymore. And my dad hides the key to the blinds very, very well. Not that I've gone looking. Some things you just don't need to look for. My wife has been peeking at me from around corners and behind furniture. It's gone from weird to terrifying. My wife Lynn and I have been together for 6 years and married for 11 months. Our entire history together has been very normal, and never once have I noticed any weird behaviors or red flags. I can't stress enough how out of character this whole thing is for her. Lynn is very kind, intelligent, and thoughtful. She's always been the no-nonsense type of person. Being childish or trying to scare me is not something she'd normally do. She doesn't even like watching horror movies. When we first started dating, she agreed to watch The Shining with me because she knew how much I loved horror. She was so scared that she didn't even make it through half of the movie before we had to turn it off. She isn't into anything creepy and has never been into pranks. It's just not her cup of tea. And that's fine. But that's what was so strange about this. It's just so unlike her. I should also add that she never had any mental health issues. And as far as I'm aware, it doesn't run in her family. I know some people are able to hide their mental health problems. But in the 6 years we've been together, I think I'd have seen some sort of sign. 2 months ago, I was in the kitchen making myself some coffee before work. I was running a bit late that morning and knew I wouldn't be able to make it to Dunkin' Donuts for my usual morning fix. I took a sip of my coffee as I hurried down the hall towards the front door, when I happened to notice Lynn peeking at me from around the corner ahead of me. I could only see her eyes, and a strand of her long dark hair hanging against the wall. The rest of her body was concealed behind the corner. I nearly spilled my coffee when I saw her. I did burn the shit out of my lips. Geez, Lynn, I said, wiping a few drops of coffee from my pants. You scared the shit out of me. She immediately popped out of view like a little kid that had been caught. I heard her scurry off towards the living room, and by the time I got to the front door, she was out of sight. It was really weird, and just totally out of character for her, like I said, but I also found it kind of funny that she was being more playful and a little less serious. I shouted that I loved her, and called her a weirdo. As I shut the door behind me, I heard her laughing. Her behavior was a bit odd, but it certainly wasn't something to call a priest over. I forgot about it by lunch, and by the time I got home, she was her normal self. I didn't bring it up, and neither did she. And life went on. The next incident happened 3 days later. It was around 2 a.m., and I had woken up to get a drink. I was standing at the kitchen island, jug of oj in hand, when I felt a strong feeling that I was being watched. For whatever reason, I looked down at the floor and saw my wife's smiling face staring back. She was peeking at me from the other side of the island, staring up at me with wide, unblinking eyes and grinning like the Cheshire Cat. I screamed. I'll admit it. Not out of irritation, but fear. For some reason at that moment I was scared. At the sound of my scream, Lynn scuttled backwards out of my view, her hands and feet smacking the tile floor as she hurried out of the kitchen on all fours. I didn't run after her, or even yell after her. I just stood there frozen in shock, wondering what fuck had possessed her to do that. It took me a little longer than I'd like to admit to go back upstairs, but I eventually did. When I got to our bedroom, Lynn was lying on her side, asleep. Or at least pretending to be. I stood there for a while, watching her breathing to be sure she really was asleep. I had the feeling she might jump out at me the moment I got into bed, but she didn't. I climbed into bed and she didn't even move. Her breathing was soft and deep, and I was starting to wonder if I'd dreamt the whole thing. The next morning, I waited for her to come down for coffee, and after handing her a mug and kissing her cheek, I decided to ask her about it. What was that about last night? I asked, keeping my tone light so I didn't offend or embarrass her. She frowned over her cup of coffee, shaking her head like she had no clue what I was referring to. You were peeking at me again, from over there, I said, pointing to the spot on the floor by the kitchen island. She followed my gaze, and when she looked back at me, she burst out laughing. She laughed so hard that I couldn't help but join her. You creep me the fuck out sometimes, you know that, I said. She giggled and set her cup on the counter and wrapped her arms around my neck. You creep me out all the time, so I guess we're even, she teased. We said our goodbyes and left for work. As I drove, I kept thinking about how creepy it had been seeing her grinning at me from behind the island like that. The sounds her hands made on the floor as she crawled away. I told myself she was just trying to be silly, just trying to join me in my love of all things horror. It's not like I was afraid of her, but it still didn't sit right with me. I started seeing her peeking at me more and more. Sometimes she'd be peeking out from behind the couch or living room curtains. Once she even managed to get inside her grandmother's old trunk that sits at the foot of our bed. I might not have even known she was there at all had the trunk's old hinges not given her away. She'd had the lid propped up just enough so that only half of her face peeked through. She'd been grinning like an excited toddler. It was unnerving. I didn't even know what to say to her. All I could do was stare. When I finally found my voice, I asked her why on earth was she doing this. She didn't answer, but she had slowly closed the lid, shutting herself inside the trunk. I just walked away, feeling disturbed. I didn't understand why she was doing it, but it clearly made her happy. I just hoped she would tire of the game quickly. Lynn didn't peek at me for the next 2 weeks. I started to think she was done with her weird prank, and I was relieved. We were watching a show on Netflix one night, and I jokingly said that I hadn't seen her peeking at me lately, and that she must have given up on her spy game. She looked up at me with a small smile and said, "Maybe I've just gotten better at it." I didn't say anything, but I wondered whether or not she was joking. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. Was she still peeking at me when I wasn't looking, and I just hadn't noticed? And if so, what the hell was she getting out of this? I started to feel paranoid, constantly checking whether she was watching from around the corner or behind a door. I was jumpy whenever I was home and she wasn't in full view of me. I felt stupid and a little crazy. But after a few weeks without another incident, I began to relax. I stopped checking behind furniture and walls and told myself it was just a bad memory. Then a few days ago, things got so much worse. Lynn left to go to a friend's, and I lounged on the couch and played a couple games on my laptop. Around 9 p.m., I hopped in the shower, and as I was washing the soap from my hair, I felt that awful feeling that I was being watched. I slowly opened my eyes and almost had a fucking heart attack. Lynn was peeking from behind the shower curtain, her entire head stretched into the shower, leaving just her body outside. Her long dark hair hung against the curtain, the ends dripping with water. Her mouth hung open in a terrible grin, eyes wide and red, as if she hadn't blinked in a while. I screamed and jumped back against the wall. She didn't move, nor did her smile waver. Her makeup ran down her cheeks in 2 black streaks. She looked giddy and completely deranged. I was fucking terrified. We stood like that for a few moments, neither of us saying a word. Finally, after what felt like forever, she slowly pulled her head back out of the shower, and I watched her blurry figure through the curtain as she moved backwards towards the bathroom door. A second later, the bathroom door slammed shut, hard enough to rattle the mirror. I screamed again and jumped out of the shower to lock the door. I stayed inside the bathroom for over an hour. Maybe I overreacted to some of you. But joke or not, I wasn't going to put up with the crazy shit anymore. That's what I kept telling myself as I paced in my bathroom, stopping to listen at the door every few minutes. Suddenly I heard a muffled sound, and I pressed my ear against the bathroom door, straining to listen. I couldn't hear anything, but I envisioned Lynn standing on the other side of the door, giggling at her joke. I felt a surge of anger. I was beyond pissed at being made to feel scared in my own house and made to hide in the bathroom for an hour. All for what? Some joke? If it was a joke, it was an awful one. "What the fuck, Lynn?" I snapped. "This shit is getting really fucking annoying." I waited for her to apologize or to call me a jerk. But instead I heard a faint moan, so quiet I wondered if I heard it at all, and then complete silence. "Lynn," I called out, not able to even hide the shakiness in my voice. I got no response, just my own heavy breathing. "I swear to God, just fucking stop it," I yelled, pounding my fist on the door. I waited for her to cuss me out, something I would expect from me talking to her like that. I never screamed at her before, but there was nothing, just the occasional drip from the shower head. I won't deny that I was scared, too afraid to open the damn door and face my own wife. I waited another 30 minutes or so, which feels like a fucking lifetime when you're scared. Finally, I decided I wasn't going to spend the night hiding in my bathroom, so I got down on my knees and peered under the door. I almost expected to see her face peeking back at me, but thankfully I didn't. I could see straight down the hallway to the top of the stairs. But no Lynn. I didn't know if I should be happy about that or not. I looked for a few minutes, waiting to see her head pop up over the top step, but it never came. I stood up, my hand hovering over the door, and mentally prepared myself to open it. I slowly turned the lock with shaky fingers, and was about to yank it open when I heard a sound that still makes me feel nauseous when I think about it. A moan, louder than before, but this time I was able to tell just where it was coming from. I turned my head to the closet door as if in slow motion, and locked eyes with my wife, who was peeking out at me from the slight gap. Her eyes were still wide as ever, and her mouth was hanging open in the most grotesque, gaping smile I'd ever seen. I didn't even scream. I was too scared for even that. Her hands were clasped to her chest, body trembling with sheer delight, as if she could barely contain her excitement. A short, raspy moan bubbled up from her throat, deep and raw, sending a shiver through my entire body. Somehow I found the ability to pull the bathroom door open and ran as fast as I could all the way down the steps, snagging my keys and phone from the table in the living room before running outside to my car. I could hear her shrill laughter behind me, but I didn't hear her getting closer. I didn't bother shutting the front door. I drove away from the house faster than I legally should have, shivering the entire time, either from fear or the cold. Maybe a little of both. I hadn't grabbed a coat or even a pair of shoes. I was still in my boxers and my hair was still damp. I drove straight to my brother Chris's house about 40 minutes away, ignoring any and every call and text I got. I didn't check my phone until I was safely parked in my brother's driveway. Lynn had called 4 times and sent a flurry of texts, all wondering where I'd gone and why I left like that. I threw my phone at the dash in a rage, furious at her nonchalant attitude. My brother and his wife were surprised to see me, especially dressed in just a pair of boxers, but told me to stay as long as I needed. Chris lent me some clothes and asked me what happened. I told him Lynn and I had a fight, but didn't get into the details. I didn't want him to think I was overreacting, leaving my wife over a prank, even if it was a strange one. I mean, hadn't I encouraged her for years to lighten up instead of being so serious all the time? I had wanted her to relax and loosen up, but this was definitely not what I'd had in mind. I tried to sleep on their sofa, but my brain wouldn't let me sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Lynn's face staring at me from inside the closet. Knowing she'd been in there with me the entire time made my skin crawl. She'd never left the fucking bathroom at all. Instead, she slipped inside the closet and slammed the bathroom door shut to fool me. The mere thought of going back home gave me anxiety. I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Chris ended up giving me a sleeping pill so I was able to get a little rest. My sleep was filled with terrible dreams, all of Lynn's smiling face. I woke up just as the sun started to rise. My sore body ached from the sofa, and I felt drained. I knew I'd have to call Lynn at some point, but I didn't know what to say to her. I wouldn't be going home unless she gave me her word she'd never do any more creepy shit. I just wanted my wife back. Her normal, serious self never looked so good to me. I was contemplating calling her and telling her that, when that familiar feeling came over me, I was being watched. I was staring at the ceiling, my heart in my throat. I didn't want to look away, but the longer I ignored the feeling, the worse it got. My eyes drifted away from the ceiling almost on their own. Her face was pressed up against the window beside the couch, staring down at me with that same gaping smile. Drool dribbled down her lips, leaving 2 long streaks down the glass. I didn't know how long she'd been there, but something told me she'd been there quite a while, possibly all night. I didn't bother screaming, though I was afraid anger trumped any fear I felt at that moment. I jumped up from the couch and pounded my palm against the glass. "Lynn, are you crazy? What the hell is wrong with you? Just go home," I shouted. "Now!" She didn't move, and her ghastly expression never changed. If anything, her smile only grew, as if she had never been more elated. I could hear Chris and his wife moving around upstairs, as if Lynn could hear them from her place outside. Her head twitched slightly in their direction, and she began to close her mouth slowly. Chris called my name from upstairs, obviously concerned. I turned to see him and his wife, Rebecca, hurrying down the steps. When I turned back to the window, Lynn was gone. The only sign she'd been there at all was the 2 streaks of drool still dripping down the glass. I tried explaining to Chris and Rebecca about waking up to see Lynn watching me through their window. They were skeptical. Who wouldn't be? Chris and I went outside to the spot in front of the window, but there were no footprints in the dirt, just a slight indent. Animal probably, Chris guessed, and I didn't argue. He and Rebecca assumed I dreamt the entire episode, but they didn't understand, and I was too tired to explain it to them. I called out of work that day and turned my cell off. I didn't want to face Lynn. Just talking to her was too much for me at that point. I really started to believe something was irreversibly wrong with her, that no matter what promises she made, we'd never be the same again. The thought saddened me to my core. I cried most of the morning. By noon I figured I was ready to confront her, give her one last chance to explain herself. I could at least give her that after 6 years, I told myself. I turned my phone on and saw the dozens of texts she'd sent, all from a seemingly concerned wife. Can we talk? I love you. Please call me. I'm really worried. Can you answer? Just come home. And more of the same. All texts telling me she loved me, and she wanted me home. How worried she was. Not a damn one addressing the crazy shit she pulled. Like she hadn't been acting like a character from a Stephen King book. Even her texts were different. She normally texted novels just to tell me to pick up a loaf of bread. You'd think she'd have more to say to me after her bizarre shenanigans. I know it probably seems childish to some of you who are miles away from this situation. But if you saw the way Lynn had looked at me, how she scampered away on all fours like some wild animal, grinning at me from inside the closet like a lunatic, then I think you'd find my reaction was warranted. I ended up staying with Chris and Rebecca for another night. I didn't wake up yesterday until afternoon, and thankfully, I didn't see Lynn's face watching me through the window. I don't want to pry because it's not my place, but is this fight something that can be mended? Rebecca asked. She'd made us both a sandwich for lunch, and I knew she wanted to breach the subject without seeming to be nosy. I don't know. She's like a different person, I said, choosing my words carefully. I still wasn't ready for her or Chris to know the full extent of the batshit craziness I had been dealing with. People change, Ben, but she's still the same woman you married. Maybe you both just need to talk through your issues. Whatever's going on, I'm sure it can be fixed, she said, ever the peacemaker. I think it's beyond that now. I don't think talking would help. I just don't trust her, I said. The words stung in my heart. I missed and loved my wife. But how could I live with someone like that? Living in constant fear didn't sound too appealing. Lynn loves you. She has to be absolutely crushed, she said. I don't know about that, I said. Well, she certainly seemed like it to me. I've never seen her so upset. Very much unlike the Lynn I know. Rebecca said, shaking her head sadly. It took a full minute for her words to really sink in, and when they did, I felt dread worming its way through my skin. Wait, what do you mean? You saw her? You saw Lynn? I asked, my mouth suddenly dry. Rebecca nodded casually as if that fact wasn't nightmare fuel. Maybe for her it wasn't. She stopped by this morning just after Chris left for work, she said, cleaning the plates from the table. I didn't see her car, though. Maybe she took an Uber or something. Beck, what did she say? Did she come inside? I asked, sweat starting to break out on my forehead. I began looking around, examining corners as though a predator lurked behind them. Number. She just asked if you were awake yet, and I said that you weren't. I asked if she wanted me to wake you, but she said no. Just said to let you sleep, she said as she washed the dishes. That's all? She didn't say anything else? I asked. Number. She looked awful, though, like she hadn't slept in days. I think you should call her. I got up from the table and thanked Rebecca for lunch. I felt a little bit better at the knowledge that at least she hadn't come inside. Still, I needed to double-check that the doors were locked. I sat for a while trying to figure out what to do next. I didn't want to go home, but I felt that I owed it to Lynn to help her if I could. Hadn't I sworn an oath to love and honor her through sickness and in health? Clearly, she was very sick. If she was sick, which I truly believe she was, I had to try and get her the help she needed. But I didn't even know where to start. I didn't want to call the police. And besides, what the hell was I going to tell them? That my wife was peeking at me? That she was being creepy? As bizarre as she'd been, she still hadn't committed any crime. Not yet, anyway. The police would have probably said that I was overreacting. But this wasn't some prank. It felt wrong. Dangerous even. Like something sinister lurked beneath her smile. I knew as her husband I was well within my rights to have her committed, but what if she simply acted normal in their presence? She'd obviously been able to fool Rebecca into thinking she was just a concerned wife. As long as the doctors didn't find her a danger to herself or others, they'd have no choice but to release her after 72 hours. I felt lost and overwhelmed, so I did what any husband in my position would do. I called her mother. I didn't want to, believe me. Her mother, Marianne, and I were never on the best of terms. We'd never fought or anything like that. She just wasn't a very warm person and wasn't really easy to get along with. She hardly ever smiled, and when she did, only her lips would move into a thin-lipped smile, leaving her eyes as blank as before. She gave off this aura that felt like she was permanently on the offensive. I'd only met her twice, and both times were for such short visits. I got the impression she didn't approve of me for her daughter. Lynn always ushered us out quickly, as she didn't want me to feel uncomfortable, which I was grateful for. Being in her mother's company felt almost unbearable, like walking on glass. I was glad when we moved 3 states away, so we didn't have to see her often. I was happy to avoid the woman, but I needed her help. I really didn't want to talk to her at all, but I had to talk to someone, and someone who knew Lynn better than I did. So I grit my teeth and did what I had to. "Yes," she answered, already sounding irritated. "Marianne, it's me, Ben. Do you have a minute to talk?" I asked. I could hear her cluck her tongue in irritation. "I'm in the middle of writing some checks, but if you insist, I suppose I can spare a moment. What is it that you want to discuss, Benjamin?" She said coolly. "It's about Lynn. She's been acting strangely, and I was wondering if you had any idea whether there was something—" I was quickly interrupted. "It's a bit difficult to follow your rambling, Benjamin. What is that you want from me?" she asked. I could almost see her standing there in her thin sweater and slacks, tapping her fingernails impatiently on the table. "I wanted to know if you'd ever noticed any odd behavior, or possibly any mental health issues," I asked. There was a long, uncomfortable pause that I couldn't tell was because she was just thinking, or something else. Finally, after a few seconds, she spoke. "I'm not sure if this is one of your jokes, Benjamin, but if so, I don't find the humor in it. Now I do have business to attend to, as I've said, so if you don't mind," she said, but I cut her off before she could get rid of me. "Marianne, it's not a joke. I'm sincerely concerned about Lynn's mental health. Her behavior has been very erratic lately. I'm very worried about her, and I figured as her mother you would be as well," I said, my frustration evident in my voice. "If you're truly concerned, then I suggest you get the health professionals involved. I don't know what you expect of me," she snapped. I could tell she was seconds away from hanging up, and for some reason I was desperate not to let her. I had the feeling that she knew a lot more than she was letting on. "Please, if not for me, do it for Lynn." I tried. I heard a faint, shaky intake of breath, as if she were trying to hold her steely persona together but failing. "Marianne, what's word—" I started. "Benjamin, I don't know what to tell you. My only advice would be to seek professional help. Do not call here again. Goodbye." I tried to call out to her, but she'd hung up. I tried to wrap my head around the call and her refusal to help me. Even if she didn't like me, why wouldn't she want to help her own daughter? I couldn't understand that. I tried to replay the conversation. desperate to find something I missed. After a while, I almost gave up until I remembered her last words to me. Seek professional help. She'd said those words with a bit of urgency. I could have just been grasping at straws, but no. I was sure her voice had changed ever so slightly when she'd said that. As if they were very important. What had she meant? I assumed she'd been referring to medical professionals, but maybe she was referring to someone else. Someone that she didn't, for some reason, feel comfortable saying directly. Or maybe I was just desperate. I waited for Chris to get home, and after a very long and exhausting conversation with him and Rebecca, I convinced them that Lynn truly needed psychiatric help. I didn't tell them everything. I wasn't prepared to go into it yet, but I told them about our last encounter. How she'd hidden in the bathroom, peeking at me from the closet. They were obviously shocked, but thankfully they believed me. They too just wanted to help her. Still, they didn't think it was all that serious. Weird, maybe, but not dangerous. They just kept saying that Lynn had to be playing some kind of weird joke. Maybe for YouTube, Rebecca offered, if only half-heartedly. Chris didn't think we should involve the police just yet. He offered instead to go with me, and I readily accepted. He reasoned that calmly talking to her, trying to coax her into going willingly, was the best recourse. I agreed to do it his way. At least I wouldn't be going into that house alone. We drove over this morning, just after breakfast. There was no way I was going at night. When we pulled into the driveway, my stomach began doing somersaults. Her car wasn't there, but I still didn't let my guard down. The front door was ajar, and for a split second I thought we'd see her eyes staring through the gap. I was shaking and starting to sweat. Chris, however, was fine. He waited for me to open the door, his hands in his pockets like he was going on a fucking stroll through the park. I envied his ignorance. I pushed the door open and was immediately hit with the stench of rot. Chris smelled it too, and he walked in the house behind me with his nose scrunched up. "What do you guys use to clean the floors around here, shit?" Chris mumbled. "Shut up," I said, my eyes darting around for any signs of Lynn. The house was deadly quiet and dark despite being 10 in the morning. All the curtains were closed up tight, refusing to allow any sunlight inside. If I hadn't left it just 2 days prior, I'd have thought the house to be abandoned. We moved through each room, carefully checking any place that she might hide, occasionally calling her name. "Why the fuck are you looking under the couch?" Chris asked eventually. "Aren't we looking for your wife?" He was looking at me like I was a moron. "Let's just go upstairs," I whispered. He shook his head but followed me up the stairs to check the bathroom and spare bedroom. On the way up, my shoes crunched over pieces of glass that looked to be littered over a few of the steps. I noticed that one of Lynn and my wedding portraits that hung on the wall along the staircase had been smashed. The frame hung crookedly, all the glass removed. I stared at the picture, a lump forming in my throat. We had taken the photo just after leaving the church, after saying our vows. She looked so beautiful in her white gown. I looked at Lynn's beautiful face. I never dreamed her face would ever be a source of terror for me. We climbed the rest of the steps and checked the spare bedroom, but it looked completely untouched. I was hesitant to go into the bathroom, my fear from that night coming back to me all at once. Chris noticed and offered to go in by himself, but I couldn't let him do that. So we walked in together, checking the closet and the shower. The bathroom looked as if it hadn't been touched since the night I left. "I don't think she's here, Ben. Why don't you pack some clothes and we'll try coming back tomorrow or something?" Chris said. I nodded and went into our bedroom and shoved some clothes into a duffel bag. When I checked inside our closet, I came across the source of the smell and gagged. Chris took one look and lost all color in his face. He had to go stand by the stairs to get away from the sight and smell. I gazed down in shock at what lay inside my bedroom closet. Soaking into the rug were at least a dozen eyeballs, all carefully laid out in pairs. Some were as large as a quarter, while others were as tiny as a marble. I stared down at the eyes she'd collected from small animals, and I wondered how she'd gotten them, and shuddered at the thought. Man, I thought I had it bad with Becca's shoe addiction. But fuck me. Your wife's in here collecting eyeballs, Chris said, gagging. Ben, I think we should go. He called from the hall. I'm getting nauseous. All right. I grabbed my duffel and shut the closet door on my new nightmare. I stepped out into the hall and took a deep breath of air. I could taste the rot on my tongue and I couldn't help but gag. Who the fuck lines up eyeballs in their closet like that? Chris mumbled. I tried to tell you she needed help, I said. She doesn't need help, Ben. She needs a fucking exorcist, he said. You coming or what? I can't stand the smell any. His words died in his throat, and his eyes grew wide with fear. I didn't ask him why. I could feel it. Someone was watching me, and I didn't think it was the eyes in the closet. I turned around, my eyes slowly scanning the bedroom. Christ, I whispered, as I finally saw what we'd missed. Under the bed, curled on her side, watching us with the excitement of a kid on Christmas morning, was my wife. She held her hands together just under her chin, and they were shaking eagerly. Now that she knew she'd been found, I could hear the quiet noises she was making. A sort of hiccuping sound in her throat, as if the excitement was just too much for her. It was unnerving to say the least. Wide eyes, and that same huge smile. Everything in me told me to run, but I forced it away. This was my wife. No matter how twisted, she was still the woman I married. I had to help her. Lynn, I said softly. She didn't respond, but her head bobbed back and forth in two quick little movements, as if she were nodding. Baby, I just want to help, okay? Can you let me do that? I asked. I had taken a single step forward, approaching her like some kind of dangerous animal. I love you, Lynn, I said softly, taking another step closer. She let a tiny moan escape her wide-open mouth, and I had to resist the urge to run. Her shoulders were starting to quiver, and her eyes grew as large as saucers. I crouched down so I could see her better, and immediately saw the blood. Her hands were covered in it. They trembled more the closer I got, as if she was barely able to contain herself. Lynn, are you hurt? You're bleeding, I said. She bobbed her head again, her bloody fingers moving up and down as if playing an invisible piano. They occasionally grazed her chin, leaving smears of blood on her skin. I wanted to recoil in disgust. The smell that was coming off of her was revolting. I could feel the vomit trying to climb up my throat. Her lips were dry and stretched thin, blood seeping between the cracks. I knew she wouldn't come out on her own, but I didn't want to leave her in the state she was in. I scooted closer and reached out to her. The excited hiccuping sounds got louder and her hands shook, fingers flexing. It was then that I could see the blood oozing from in between her fingers. Oh my God, Lynn, you're bleeding, I said. Instinctively, I reached out to take her hand, but before I could even touch her, her hand sprang out towards me. A sharp pain shot through my arm, and I fell back on my ass. My arm burned, and I could see the blood dripping down onto the carpet. I looked back at her in shock and saw her grinning madly, her fingers clutching a large shard of glass. You all right in there? Chris asked from behind me. I turned my head slightly and nodded to him, cradling my arm to my chest. When I turned back to face Lynn, I saw that her focus had shifted. She wasn't looking at me anymore, and she wasn't smiling anymore either. She was staring past me, her eyes glaring at Chris the way a hungry lion might stare at an antelope. Her mouth was still hanging open, but it was twisted into a snarl. I got to my feet and began walking backwards down the hall, afraid to take my eyes off her. Are you bleeding? Chris asked. The moment the words left his mouth, Lynn started fast scooting out from under the bed, the glass shard still in her fist. "Chris, run, go," I yelled. He must have been too afraid to move, because a second later I felt my back bump into him. He was still standing at the top of the stairs, staring at the horror that was my wife. Lynn had crawled completely out from under the bed and stood in the bedroom doorway, her face twisted in rage. Her whole body was visibly tense. Blood ran down her fingers and onto the floor. "Jesus, Lynn," Chris said. You, playing hide and seek?" I reached back and pushed him towards the steps. "Move your ass, Chris," I said as quietly but firmly as I could. Lynn bobbed her head in fast, sharp motions and began to grin, stretching her mouth open wider and wider so that her chin seemed to touch her chest. I heard Chris mutter a prayer, and then he was running down the stairs. I stood at the top of the steps, stuck between the love for a woman who clearly needed serious help and self-preservation. "I only want to help," I said, choking back tears. Her eyes focused on me once again as she slowly lifted the glass, holding it out in front of her. And then she started sprinting towards me, grinning with utter excitement. Thankfully, my body took over and I flew down the stairs, skipping 2 or 3 at a time. I made it to the front door before I felt her leap onto my back, wrapping her arms around my neck, her open mouth next to my ear so that I could hear those terrible hiccuping sounds up close. I shook her off me, knocking her to the floor. I felt a searing pain in my back as she went, but I tore open the front door and bolted to my car. Chris was standing in the front yard, talking on the phone with the police. I didn't say a word. I just ran to my car and jumped in. Chris took the hint and followed me. Still on the line with 911, I watched the rearview mirror, sure I'd see her there, running after us. But I never did. I went straight to the ER and got 11 stitches in my arm and 3 on my back. The police asked a lot of questions and went back to the house to do a search, but of course, Lynn wasn't there. They advised me to stay with a friend or relative for a while, and to file a restraining order as soon as I could. But none of those things would matter. Somehow, I just knew. I dropped Chris off at home and went to a motel an hour away. I wanted to put as much distance between me and Lynn as I could. This is where I've been for the last 4 hours. I thought maybe the police would find her. Maybe they'd get her the help she desperately needs. But now I don't think so. Because 40 minutes ago I got a text from an unknown number. Just 3 words. "I found you," and a picture attached. The picture was dark and grainy, but I instantly knew what it was. There was no mistaking my wife's eye. I started typing this out immediately after. I don't know what to do. I'm alone and scared, and I can't help but feel that I'm being watched. My job is watching a woman trapped in a room. Part 1. 3 years ago, I was looking at the local job classifieds online when one of the ads caught my eye. Not because of what it said, but because it said so little. Best I remember, the ad just read, "Job available, good pay, no benefits, discretion required." It then listed an email address, and that was all. At the time I was managing a music store, but I had already started hearing rumors we would be shutting down within the next year, and the likelihood of a transfer to another store was slim. I had been morosely looking at job listings for the last few days, but this was the first one that stood out, if only because I was bored and it was weird, so I sent an email. Half an hour later I had a response, telling me to go to a particular office building in an upscale part of the city at a precise time for my screening. I went, and after waiting for a few minutes in the lobby, I was taken into an office where I was given a series of forms and questionnaires to fill out. They collected them and told me they would be in touch. I had almost forgotten about the whole thing, until a month later I got a call saying I had moved on to the second stage of the hiring process. I was again given an address and time, and when I arrived, this time it was a different nice office park 20 miles away from the first one. I was met by a man who introduced himself as Mr. Solomon. He escorted me into a large room that contained a chair and a desk. On the desk were 2 large monitors, a keyboard and mouse, and a bolted-down metal box with 2 oversized buttons on it, one red and one green. He told me this room was a model for the place I would be working if I took the job. He described the job as follows. I would be working 7 shifts of 6 hours every week. My job would be simple. I would arrive at work 10 minutes early and enter an outer area that was like a locker room. I would have my own personal locker. I would store all belongings in the locker and change into the provided work clothes. I was never, under any circumstances, to carry any item of my own into the surveillance room. I was never, under any circumstances, to take any item with me from the surveillance room. As for what I was to do in the surveillance room, I was told that the monitor on the left would constantly show a live stream from a high-definition camera in a remote location. My job was simply to watch the camera. Once an hour, I would get onto the computer attached to the right monitor and enter a brief log describing anything interesting that occurred in the last hour. I would have no pens or pencils or paper, and I should never try to take any kind of written notes about the work. As for the red and green buttons, the red button was only to be used if there was an emergency. This meant something on the video or in my workspace that required outside help. The green button was to be hit if I saw something on the video feed that was particularly noteworthy. It would tell other people somewhere that, at least in my opinion, something interesting was going on. Solomon stressed that while I was given discretion on when to use this button, I should err on the side of only using it if and when something of real significance occurred. He pointed out the camera on the ceiling of the room we were in. He said the real room would be the same. My work would be observed, and other people were watching the room on the video feed as well. He said I was only a redundancy in case other systems failed. He then smirked and asked if I knew what he meant by redundancy. I nodded, trying not to show my irritation. I don't talk that good to people, so sometimes they think I'm dumb. That's okay. Let him think that if he paid me good enough. The pay was very good, $35 an hour. This worried me. I was already thinking this was some kind of psych experiment or secret government job, which I was okay with. But that kind of money to sit and watch a screen. My mom always told me that if something seems too good to be true, it probably is. And this was seeming too good to be true. I asked if I was going to be doing anything illegal. Solomon laughed and said no. I asked if anyone was going to get hurt. Again, he shook his head no. He said the reason they were paying so much was because they needed employees that were motivated to be professional and discreet. The work they were doing was important, and for various reasons it couldn't be discussed. If I took the job, I would have to sign papers promising I would never discuss my work there, or I could be sued or locked up. I'm only breaking that now because of everything that's happened. So I took the job, and because they wanted me to start right away, I had to quit the store with no notice. I felt bad about that, but I was excited about the new job too. It was a lot of money and seemed like easy enough work, if a bit boring. I was nervous that there was something more to it, but I told myself I would just have to see. No point in chickening out and wasting a good chance because I let my imagination go crazy. I was given the location of the job itself, and when I went there, I was amazed that it really was just like the model room I had been shown with, only a few differences. There was a locker room you had to pass through to enter the surveillance room, and there was a small bathroom attached to the real surveillance room also. The real room had a small water cooler in the corner, but because I wasn't allowed to bring anything in with me, I had to eat before or after every shift. The biggest difference, of course, was that the monitors were turned on. The right monitor was just a black and white terminal like you see in movies sometimes. I could type in my logs, but no internet to look at or anything like that. The left monitor, it was video from a room. You would call it a bedroom, I guess, because it had a bed in it. But it had lots of other stuff too. A TV, a sofa and chairs, a couple of tables, and plenty of empty space in between. The camera must be high up in a corner, because I could see pretty much everything except for the far sides of furniture. At first, though, I didn't notice any of that stuff. All I saw was her. She looked to be a little older than me and was very pretty. When I first saw her, she was laying on her side on the sofa. That was the part of the room farthest from the camera, but the picture was very clear, and I could tell that she was sleeping. I found myself leaning into the monitor more so I could see her better, and then I thought about what I was doing and felt embarrassed. It's like I was spying on her. A peeping Tom, my mom used to call it. I didn't want to be a peeping Tom, but I didn't want to be silly either. I needed to think about it slow. It was a good job, and I wasn't doing anything wrong, right? I wasn't hurting anybody. The woman looked fine, and the room was nice. She probably agreed to be there, and it's all some experiment or something. I was just overreacting, so I sat down in the chair and began my work. It didn't take long before I understood more. The woman, I took to calling her Rachel, wasn't there of her free will. I never saw her hurt, but it was clear that she never left that room except to go into what I think is a bathroom area that my camera couldn't see. Well, she never left the room on her own. Periodically, usually a couple of times a week during my shifts, men and women in strange-looking outfits would come in and take her from the room. Sometimes she would struggle, but usually she would just go along with her head hung low. They would always bring her back, though the times when she wasn't brought back during my shift were always the worst for me. I would worry about her until I got to work the next day and saw her in the room watching TV or painting. She never looked hurt or even that upset except for when they took her, and even when she fought, they were always gentle with her. Still, I knew something was wrong. I considered quitting the job, or hitting the red button and getting someone to come so I could get some answers, or calling the police and showing them what the camera was showing me. Except I was scared of losing my job, and scared of what these people might do to me if I quit or told on them. Solomon had told me when I took the job that part of being discreet was not asking questions. I would never be asked to do more than I had already been told, but I could never tell anyone what I did or saw, and I could never ask questions about what I was doing or why. So I made excuses. It was all an experiment. She was crazy or sick, and they were trying to help her. She was doing a job just like I was. Or if she really was a prisoner somewhere, at least I was watching to make sure that she was okay. If they ever tried to hurt her, or I saw that she really didn't want to be there for sure, I could get help then. In a way, I told myself, I was helping to protect her by watching. I don't expect you to think much of my excuses. I don't think much of them myself, especially now. But in my defense, when things changed, I didn't ignore it or try to explain it away. I knew something had to be done. Rachel would usually paint for an hour or two every day, and it seemed to always be during my afternoon shifts. The room had no windows as far as I could tell, but I guess she either used a clock or her own body's time to keep to a kind of schedule. I always liked to watch her paint. The thing she was painting was always facing the wrong way for me to see it, but I could see her face as she worked. She always looked peaceful and happy when she was painting, and seeing her that way, smiling serenely from time to time as she got something the way she wanted it, always made my day. I first noticed something was wrong when she started painting more frequently a few weeks ago. Her expression was more focused and serious, and there was a tension to her movements that I wasn't used to seeing. At first I thought she was just really trying to work hard on something, and I wanted to tell her not to worry. Every few weeks the others would come in and take the old paintings out anyway, bringing in a new stack of, I think the word is canvas. But it was more than her being focused. Something was wrong. She didn't look happy, and she was going for hours at a time. In the span of 3 days, she had finished 4 paintings. I had been growing more and more worried watching her work, and when she finished the 4th, I found myself telling her to just stop and rest a while. I had grown accustomed to talking to the monitor, talking to her in my own way. But she didn't stop. Instead, she began moving the paintings, arranging them on the back and seat of the long sofa at the far end of the room. This was the first time I had gotten to see any of the paintings. Even when the others were taking them out, they always seemed to be turned away from the camera. I was still worried about her, but I was also happy to finally see something she had worked on. Happy and amazed. They were beautiful. One was a beautiful green forest. Another was an old stone well. A third was a house sitting alone on a small island. The last was an old-fashioned looking movie theater. All of them looked like something out of a dream, with trailing lines of color mixing in the air around them, like leaves caught in a wind. It was only when I looked close that I realized the lines of color weren't random. They were words. Easy to miss if you weren't looking close, and by themselves they didn't seem to mean much. Just the ghost of a word somewhere in each of the paintings. Easy to lose in everything else that was being shown. I leaned into the monitor and squinted, trying to read the words. Then my heart started thudding as I made them out. Blinking and rubbing my eyes, I looked again, reading them out loud in order, left to right, top pair, then bottom. Please. Help. Me. Thomas. I pushed back from the monitor, my hand over my mouth. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how any of this could be happening. It wasn't just that she was asking for help, though that was a big part of it. It was that my name is Thomas. I thought about the camera above me and took my hand away from my face. I rolled back to the desk and sat there, trying to stop from shaking, trying to make myself take a breath. Think about it slow. The first thing was, should I hit a button? The red button was for an emergency. If she was a prisoner or something, and she was trying to escape, they might think that was an emergency. But no one had been hurt that I knew of. And I think Mr. Solomon meant save that for something that was like a police or ambulance emergency, not something like this. But what about the green button? This was definitely something noteworthy. Not only that she was asking for help, but that she was asking me for help. I made myself stop for a moment. I couldn't know for sure she was asking me. I had gone to school with several boys named Thomas. It was a common name. But the chances of her painting that name when I was working here? I didn't want to be silly, but I wasn't trying to be too... What's that word? Mom used to say it when she read her angel books. Skeptics. I didn't want to be a skeptic either. I had to believe it was probably meant for me. And that was something they would want to know. But should I hit the green button? My hands were drifting toward the metal box on the desk, but I hesitated. I didn't like breaking rules, and I was scared of what would happen if I broke these. If they really were holding her prisoner, then they were probably very bad people. But I didn't know that. Maybe they were good, and she was bad. But I looked back at the monitor for the first time since reading the words. Rachel was already moving the paintings back off the sofa, as though she knew the message had been received. A canvas in each hand, she glanced up at the camera as she moved across the room, and it felt like she was looking right at me. My chest tightened as my hands moved away from the buttons. No, I didn't think she was bad. I had watched her for years. I felt like I knew her, would know if she was bad. Strange as it seemed, in a way she was my friend, and I was going to try and help her. I spent the rest of my shift trying to act normal and think of what to do. I knew whoever else was watching might have noticed the paintings or seen how I acted, but I couldn't worry about that. I would try to play it cool and try to think how I could help her. The only people I had actually met, connected to this job, were a couple of people when I filled out the papers, and then Mr. Solomon, when he showed me the model room and told me the job. I had no way of contacting any of them except through the buttons. My checks were deposited electronically, and I had never run into anyone else who worked at the surveillance room. That thought made me stop a second. I had always thought it was weird that I never ran into someone when I was coming or going, the person I was taking over for, or the person who was taking over for me. I had always figured there must be other people, other surveillance rooms even, and they just scheduled us so we didn't run into each other, and I still thought there were others. Part of why I thought that was because it seemed like I wasn't the only person who used my surveillance room. The water cooler, the toilet paper, the soap, they all seemed go down faster than I think I was using it by myself. If that was true, maybe I could figure out who they were, and maybe they would be safer to talk to than whoever it was that I worked for. I got off work at 8 that night, and instead of grabbing some food and going home, I drove my car around the block and then parked down the street from the building where I worked. Nothing had changed while I drove around for a minute. No new cars had parked or anything, and if I was right, they didn't send anyone to replace me until they were sure I was gone anyhow. So I sat and waited. I was tired, and the street was pretty empty and boring, but I was too excited and scared to fall asleep. Every time a car passed or someone walked down the sidewalk, I tensed. I kept imagining a SUV or van pulling up behind me, men getting out and pulling me from my car, taking me somewhere like where they had Rachel to kill or torture me. Half a dozen times I almost cranked up and drove away, but every time I would think of her alone in that room. She had no one but me to help her, and I had to try. 2 hours later, a fat, balding man parked and started heading for the building. As soon as I saw he was able to unlock the door and enter, I opened my car door to go talk to him. Then I stopped. I needed to be smart. I didn't know where they were, but I was sure there were hidden cameras in the locker room and outside the building. If I go running in there and confront that guy, they'll know for sure that I'm up to something. Sighing with frustration, I shut the door back and waited until his shift was over. I considered tailing him like in the movies, but I was scared I would just lose him, or he would call someone for help. So I waited until he was walking back to his car after a 6-hour shift, hopefully far enough away that the cameras wouldn't see. And then I met the man I came to know as Charles Jeffries. Hey man, can I talk to you for a minute? His back was to me and he just waved his hand absently without looking up. Sorry, I don't have any money. Have a good... He froze as he glanced back at me while talking. Oh God. Number, you need to get out of here, kid. We aren't allowed to talk. I could tell he was scared, but I couldn't risk letting him go yet, not after all this. I stepped up and pushed the door back shut as he was trying to get into his car. So you know who I am? I tried to not sound mean, but I could hear how mad I was in my voice. He yanked at the door again, but I was still holding it and I was stronger than he was. After a second, weaker tug, he turned around, his face strained and tired looking. Yeah, I know who you are. You work here just like me, and I'm telling you, we aren't supposed to be talking. We aren't supposed to meet ever. I frowned. Mr. Solomon never told me that. He never said it was one of the rules. The man shook his head. Mr. Solomon. Yeah. Well, there are plenty of rules they don't tell you. I bet they didn't tell you what you were going to be watching before you started, did they? When I just lowered my eyes, he went on. Yeah, me either. I've been at this job for 10 years. I've seen other people come and go, usually because they broke those rules they never mentioned. The only reason I'm still here is because I keep my head down and my mouth shut. He wagged a finger at me. You should do the same, if it's not already too late. I felt my stomach curling into a cold knot. Too late? The man rubbed his face. Kid, do you think they don't know we're talking? Do you think anything happens that they don't know about? He looked back toward the building, a look of sadness and fear in his eyes. Hell, for all I know, you've already killed us both. Shaking his head, he pushed me back and started opening the door. Either way, I'm done risking it. You need to stop asking questions and just do your job. It's a lot healthier. With that, he got into his car and shut the door. I didn't try to stop him this time. Even though I had already been worried about what he was telling me, hearing it confirmed was paralyzing. What exactly was my plan? He probably didn't know any more than I did. And even if he did, what could I do with anything he told me? I walked back to my car with a heavy heart. I was still afraid, but more than that, I was sad and ashamed. I wanted to help Rachel, but I wasn't sure how. I wasn't giving up, but as I drove back to my apartment, I couldn't think of what I should do next. This wasn't a movie. I wasn't a hero. And the only ideas I had left were to either go to the police, who might be controlled by whoever I worked for, or try to get proof of her being held prisoner myself. As I parked my car and walked into my apartment building, I made a decision. Unless I thought of something better overnight, I would do both ideas. Tomorrow I would break the rule about carrying anything in. I'd use my phone to record a video of the surveillance room, of Rachel and how she was trapped somewhere, and of me telling everything else I knew. And I would email it to every newspaper, website, and internet channel I could think of. I'd then go to the police and give them a copy too if I could make it that long without getting caught. Maybe if I did all that, even if they got me, someone would help Rachel. I was filled with worry and dread at the idea of being hurt or killed. A part of me kept saying I should just do as I was told and hope that it all went away. But I couldn't live with myself if I did that. Even if I messed up, I felt like I had to try. I was so preoccupied that I didn't hear the person coming up behind me as I unlocked my apartment door. Thomas? I turned around and felt my legs weaken as I stumbled back against my door. I had to be dreaming or crazy. I grabbed the doorknob for support as I looked at the woman in front of me. It couldn't be her, but somehow it was. Rachel? She hesitated a moment before breaking into a smile. Is that what you call me? I like it. My name is actually Melanie, though. I felt my face reddening. Of course, her name wasn't actually Rachel. That was just something I made up in my head. Still, my embarrassment couldn't keep up with my confusion and joy. Is it really you? She nodded. Yeah, it's me. Rachel. Melanie grunted as I stepped forward and started hugging her. Laughing, she hugged me back for a moment, but then she whispered in my ear, Thomas, we need to talk. And not out here. Can we go inside? I broke away and nodded, wiping at my eyes as I tried to finish unlocking the door with a shaking hand. My heart was pounding, and I still felt like I was in a strange and wonderful dream. But when we had gotten inside and sat down on my living room sofa, I forced myself to focus on the biggest question I had. How? Melanie had still been smiling as we sat down, but now she looked worried and sad. Thomas, that's what I'm here to tell you. Things aren't like you think they are. They never have been. I frowned, a new line of fear cutting through my happy haze. What do you mean? She held the bridge of her nose for a moment, looking down like she was trying to figure out how to say whatever it was she had to say. Thomas, you're part of a psychological experiment. I've been a part of it for longer than you have as one of the actors, and I still don't know all the details. I'm pretty sure it's run by some government agency, and I know they're investing a lot of money and time into it. But for what reasons? That I'm not so sure. I realized I was wringing my hands. No, that wasn't right. It couldn't be right. This was some kind of trick. Melanie went on. What I do know is that you're being watched as a long-term subject. They have constructed this whole scenario where you do a secret job watching someone, Me, who looks like they might be trapped. They give you instructions and a way of making choices. You've got buttons or something you can choose between, right? I nodded weakly, my tongue thick in my throat. Yeah, a red one and a green one. She sighed and nodded. I think they're testing how much you'll obey, what choices you'll make based off of your morals, your intelligence, and your fear. It's interesting, or at least I thought so when I first joined up 6 years ago. They've never officially given me many details, just the overall gist. But people talk. The other actors and me. Sometimes we hear things and we gossip. She smiled sadly. That's what caused me to start feeling bad. I interrupted. Other actors? Melanie's eyes widened. Oh shit, yeah, sorry. I think they still call him Mr. Solomon? And there are others too. When I just stared at her, she went on. Anyway, for a long time it was just the normal job, right? I spend 6 hours a day acting like I'm this trapped girl, mainly faking painting or watching TV. You know, boring stuff. I couldn't help but interrupt again, hating the hurt trembling in my voice. You fake the painting? You aren't really painting those wonderful pictures? Now Melanie looked embarrassed. No, sorry, I can't paint a bit. I'm a pretty good singer, though. She tried to smile, but faltered. Reaching forward, she touched my arm. That's why they always have the paintings turned where you can't see them. They're already done beforehand. All you ever see is some blank canvases and, well, when they want me to show you something. Her expression darkened as she went on. That's why I had to break the rules and contact you. When they started doing this hidden message, mind game bullshit, I got worried. Worried you would take it too serious, that you could get hurt or even hurt yourself. As soon as you left your shift tonight, I talked to one of the guys in the video department. He told me about how you had reacted. Showed me how you were still parked down the street from the building. I drove over. The bedroom set is in a building outside of town. I saw you sitting in your car and I almost approached you then, but I was scared of getting caught and fired. So I parked and waited until I could follow you somewhere else and let you know I was okay. She blinked back tears. I'm ashamed to say I almost left a couple of times. I don't want to lose this job, and I tried to tell myself you would be okay after a day or two. I could get them to change the script enough that you felt like I was okay and wouldn't worry too much. I felt an angry heat growing in my chest. Well, that's nice of you. She looked up, her eyes red. I know. I'm a shit. I'm so sorry. I was being selfish and cowardly, but I didn't actually leave. And then when I saw Charlie leaving the building, saw you running over to talk to him, I knew they were escalating it even further. Charlie? Melanie rolled her eyes in frustration. Shit. Yeah, sorry. Charlie Jeffries. He's another actor. In an earlier version of the experiment, he actually played Mr. Solomon, but they decided he wasn't scary enough, so now he's usually in one of the suits. He's actually done that for your version a lot. You just can't recognize him under all that getup they wear. I kept curling and uncurling my hands on my lap. It was all too much. I felt like a pinball going between anger and relief, and embarrassment and confusion. So all that stuff he told me, that was all just to scare me? See how I'd react? She nodded as she sniffled and wiped her nose with the back of her hand. Yes, I'm sorry. That's why I knew I couldn't wait any longer to tell you. I could see how worried and scared you were going back to your car. I pulled my arm back from her touch. Well, thanks, I guess. At least you stopped me before I went to the police and looked like a joke in front of them too. I just wanted her gone, her sympathetic, pitying eyes off of me. Thanks for stopping by and letting me in on it. I tried to make my voice sound hard and unfeeling, but it came out watery instead. Standing up, I turned away from her so she couldn't see as I started to cry. If you don't mind, I need time to think about everything. It's a lot. A moment passed, and then her hand was on my shoulder. Thomas, you don't have anything to be embarrassed about. They are very good at what they do. All you did was what you thought was right. Because you're a good man. I shrugged. I thought that you were in trouble and I wanted to help. She gently turned me toward her, and when I looked up, she smiled and sniffed again. I know, but you need to realize most people wouldn't have tried to help. Not when it meant giving up their job or risking themselves like that. Not for a stranger. I wiped at my face as I looked away. Well, I still feel dumb, but I'm glad it's not real. I'm glad you're okay, that we both are. I paused and caught her eye again. We are, aren't we? Safe, I mean. She hesitated before nodding. Yeah, I think so. Like I said, they have a lot invested in whatever this is, and the fact that they're willing to go as far as they have with you makes me wonder. But I've never seen any signs of anyone getting hurt. I think the worst that could happen is one or both of us gets fired. I felt my face getting red again. Oh, don't worry about that. I'm going to quit tomorrow. I'll finally get to hit their damn buttons. Maybe both of them. I started to smile, but then I saw the look on Melanie's face. Thomas, please don't do that. I don't think they would hurt us, but if you up and quit, they'll figure out I've talked to you. I don't think they watch us all the time, but I don't know what they can find out. You know, tracking cell phones, spy satellites, whatever. I'm taking a big risk just being here, and I don't want them catching on. I took a step back from her. So you want to keep getting paid to trick people like me? She reached out and grabbed my right hand. I had been clenching it unconsciously, and it relaxed at her touch. No, I don't want to. But I wasn't expecting this. How the experiment has changed, getting to actually meet you. I can't do it long term, but another month or two to save up money. Now that you're in on it and won't be scared or hurt by it anymore. She smiled. That I can do. That we can both do. We can keep going like normal, take some more of their money, and then one of us can quit. The next month, the other one can. How does that sound? I shrugged uncertainly. It made some sense, and once I had calmed down, it would probably make more. She gave my hand a squeeze. And when this is all over, I want to get to know you better. I know I've been playing a role, but for the most part, that's been me you've been watching all this time. I think it's only fair I get to see more of you too. She blushed. Assuming you're interested in that. I felt my hand growing clammy in hers as my stomach fluttered. Well, I mean, yeah, I would really like that. Swallowing, I added, how long do we have to wait to see each other again? Melanie grinned at me. Work another month or so. Save what you can. And then quit. I'll wait another 2 or 3 weeks and then I'll do the same. And then... She looked up at the ceiling as she pondered it for a moment. And I was struck again by how beautiful she was, even if she was a little different in person than I had imagined. 3 months from tonight we'll meet right here. I'll come over and we can start getting to know each other better. How's that sound? Returning her smile, I nodded. That sounds great. When she left a couple of minutes later, part of me hated to see her go, but another part was relieved. I was so exhausted, and while I was so happy she was okay and we had finally met, I felt like the burned-up wire in an old light bulb. I needed time alone, time to think and calm down, and most of all, time to rest. I didn't really even remember falling asleep, and when I woke up, I realized my alarm had been buzzing for over 30 minutes. I jumped up and raced to get to my shift at work. As she had been leaving, Melanie had stressed again how we needed to act completely the same. That meant not freaking out, but it also meant not acting like everything was okay either. If I suddenly showed no signs of being worried about her, that would tip them off too. I promised, and she left after a brief hug and kiss. Remembering that now, through the haze of my tiredness the night before. It felt like a dream. Still, I went into the surveillance room with a much lighter heart. I didn't have to worry or feel guilty anymore about not helping her, and there was some satisfaction in finally pulling one over on the people that had tricked me for so long. Besides, in 3 months I would be done with this place and get to see Melanie again. In person, at least, because I got to watch her on the video feed as soon as I came into work. She was asleep when I first got there, and I found myself wondering if she was as tired as I still felt. When she woke up later and started reading a book, I found myself beginning to smile and had to stop myself. I should still be worried acting, not smiling like I had a crush. I had to do better so Melanie didn't get in trouble. An hour or so later, she started working on another of her paintings. Watching her work, I was amazed at how real it all looked. It was hard to see everything from my angle, but I would have sworn she had paint on those brushes and was really painting whatever was on the canvas. I found myself feeling proud of her. She really was a great actress. Not only didn't I see her giving any clues that we had met or talked, but she really did seem different in the room than she had in my apartment. I suppose that was what she had meant by playing a role. I was almost at the end of my shift, and while I hated to leave her, I had to admit that I was ready for some more sleep. Trying to guard my reactions all day had been exhausting, and I was dreading the next few weeks. But then I realized she was done painting. I expected her to just go and do something else. But instead she picked up the canvas at its edges and carefully walked it over to the sofa. Her body was blocking it at first, but then she stepped aside. It was a painting of a massive tree. The bark was a dark red, with a huge twisting trunk that broke off into a dozen branches. Those branches were covered in leaves that were so deep green they almost reminded me of storm clouds more than the top of a tree. Like all the paintings, I felt touched by it, even now that Melanie had told me she didn't paint them. The images themselves, combined with the colors and the small details, they really were amazing. Just like this one. If you looked close enough, you could see that there were several small blackbirds in the branches of the tree. It was funny, but it almost looked like they were made out of words. I felt my heart start to hammer, and I forced myself to stay calm. No point in being silly. I knew it was all a game now, and I just had to play my part a little while longer. Still, the worried me would want to know what the words said, so I might as well try to read them. I squinted, following the birds right to left and top to bottom. That girl isn't me. I looked away from the painting to see Rachel staring up at me. She looked terrified. Oh no. I hunt down the government's mistakes. If you are one of those people who think the government is hiding countless secrets from you and constantly covering things up, then you would be absolutely right. I'm one of the many people they hire to clean up their mistakes. I'm not entirely sure why they chose me. There really isn't much special about me, but perhaps that's exactly why they chose me. I was already a loner, and I'm not going to cure cancer or create the next weapon of mass destruction, so I'm easily disposable. They approached me one day after I finished working my shift at a fast food joint. I'm not sure I had much of a choice, but my life was so dull I was ready for any kind of change up anyway. The men who came to my door didn't even tell me what I would be doing, simply that if I wanted to aid my country to follow them. I didn't look back once, and as strange as my life has gotten, I still don't regret it. The next year of my life would be grueling. I was put through extreme physical and mental training. I learned about things that I thought only existed in movies. I'm not sure what would have happened to me had I failed the training, but I can't imagine they would have just let me go back to my normal life. Not once did they mention what I was training for during that year, not until I graduated. Upon getting the seal of approval from higher-ups, I was brought into a small room with black suits and finally informed of what I would be doing. My new job would be hunting down failed experiments and other oddities that the government had failed to contain. Not all jobs would be the same. Some would be relatively easy, while others next to impossible. Most missions would come with the option of bringing the target back dead or alive, but of course it would be preferable to always bring them back alive for further experimentation. My first assignment would be on the easy side. Codename: the Ice Cream Man. The Ice Cream Man, like most failed experiments, was at one point a human. He still has the appearance of one, your typical ice cream truck driver, but he's essentially a robot, only concerned with doing his job. So, what's so special about the Ice Cream Man then? Well, I'm never told the why of the creatures I hunt, but I always put together my own ideas. The Ice Cream Man's truck is really the special part. The music that comes from the horns works as almost a human magnet. It entrances anyone within hearing distance to approach the truck. Once you approach the truck, you buy ice cream. I've heard the ice cream tastes delicious, but of course you'll never know for sure, because the ice cream causes anyone who eats it to basically enter a fugue state. For the next 12 hours after consuming the ice cream, you will carry on your day as you normally do, but you'll remember nothing the next day. I'm sure you can see why this would be a valuable asset to the government. Unfortunately, the scientists put in charge of testing the Ice Cream Man underestimated him a bit. Before they knew it, they had woken up 12 hours later wondering where their test subject had gone. I'm sure I was given this simple assignment as sort of a test. I was given a pair of enhanced noise-blocking earplugs, and was sent on my way to the Ice Cream Man's last known location. He wasn't hard to find. I just had to follow the mass of vehicles that had lined up to get their sweet treat. I allowed him to serve everyone in the area. It would make my job of taking him much easier if no one remembered it. After everyone had their ice cream, I lined up myself. He attempted to serve me, but instead I reached into the truck and injected him with a tranquilizer. He may only be a shell of a person now, but he's not immune to good old-fashioned medication. I tied him up and hitched his truck to my vehicle. I dropped him off at the nearest government facility and awaited my next target. As I said, this would be one of the easier assignments. My next wouldn't be quite so simple. Codename: the Rippler. Unlike the Ice Cream Man, the Rippler was still mostly human. He hadn't lost his emotions or become a mindless zombie, and perhaps that was the problem. Through intense experimentation, the Rippler had gained the ability to create an intense concentrated earthquake. He had collapsed the facility he was being stored in. The main concern with the Rippler was his danger to others around him. If he used his ability in a heavily populated area, countless lives could be lost. This was one of the few cases I've been advised to not bring the target back alive. Once again, I feel as though this assignment was a test, just a different kind of test. The government wanted to see if I would kill for them without hesitation, and it's possible if I did, then there would truly be no escape for me. That was fine though. I had no intentions of leaving. The Rippler was a bit more difficult to find, mostly because he wasn't trying to attract the attention of everyone around him. But if the government wants you, they will find you. He had relocated to a small town, changed his name, his face, everything in an attempt to escape. I almost felt bad for the guy. I doubt he had volunteered himself to be a guinea pig for the government, and now all he wanted was a normal life. Once I found the town he was staying in, I made sure to keep my distance. Didn't want him going nuclear on me. I confirmed he was indeed my target by collecting some DNA samples from his trash. Now all that was left was to take him down. I didn't want to kill him, but I didn't have a lot of options. The scientists who had created him were still unsure of the extent of his powers and his ability to control them. Had I brought him back alive, there's no telling if the government even has a facility capable of holding him. I did what I thought was best. After he returned home one night, I put a bullet between the Rippler's eyes. It wasn't a good feeling, but I continued to convince myself it was necessary. I dropped his body off and was thanked for my services. It wouldn't get easier from here either. My next target. Codename Ghoul. This one was truly a monster. I'm not sure what the government was trying to create in Ghoul, but I don't think they got what they wanted. Ghoul has enhanced strength and speed, but with one slight problem. He eats humans. Who knows? Maybe that's exactly what the government wanted. As you can imagine. No, Ghoul found a way to escape. After a while, you would think these government scientists would get better at containing their experiments, but that doesn't seem to be the case. This mission might not have been so bad, but I was given strict orders that Ghoul was to be brought back alive. All my lethal weapons were stripped and replaced with tranquilizers strong enough to bring down a rhino. I put in a request to have a partner for this assignment, but of course I was swiftly denied. Ghoul had taken up residence in a forest. This might not have been so bad if not for the fact this forest had an extremely popular hiking trail. There had always been frequent disappearances in the forest, a lot of them chalked up to suicides. But since Ghoul had escaped, that number had amplified significantly. The government did me a solid and got the trail shut down for the weekend, so it would just be me and Ghoul. I wouldn't have to worry about anyone else getting in the way. I've always wanted to go on a hiking date, but this wasn't quite what I had pictured. I set out into the forest looking for signs of his nest. I had made sure not to shower all week in preparation. If he came to me, it makes my job of dragging him back to my vehicle a lot easier, and I'm sure he would get hungry eventually. After about an hour of following markings and footprints that I assumed had to belong to Ghoul, I began to come across bones, human bones. So, I was getting closer. I followed the path for a few more minutes before I began to hear noises. Looks like my date had arrived. I heard tree branches shaking as he drew nearer. After only a few moments, he was standing on a large tree right in front of me. He looked down on me, studying me. He really wasn't that big, maybe 5 with an average frame, but looks can be deceiving. His skin was a sickly yellow, and his hair had begun to recede as if he was an old man, but he was clearly much younger. His eyes were pure white, no longer containing anything else. After a brief stare down, he jumped. There was a good 50 feet between us, so I thought I would have a few seconds to ready myself, but I was wrong. As if he was a video game character, he soared from the tree and landed directly on top of me. I had just enough time to pull out a tranquilizer and shove it into his side, but it wasn't enough. Despite the strength of the tranquilizer, he seemed relatively unaffected. He shrugged it off and proceeded to take a chunk of flesh out of my shoulder. I lay helpless as he began to chew my flesh. I knew it wouldn't be long before he went back for seconds. I struggled to pull out another tranquilizer. I managed to pull another one out right before he began to lunge in for another bite. I jammed the second tranquilizer directly into his neck. I felt his teeth begin to lock onto my own neck, but before he bit down, he passed out. I let out the biggest sigh of relief of my life and pushed him off of me. I placed the special restraints I had been given for him on, making sure the muzzle I was given for him was extra tight. I wasn't sure how long the tranquilizers would last, but hopefully long enough for me to deliver this monster. Despite missing a chunk of my shoulder, I had escaped alive. This was just one monster that science had created. I could only imagine what my future would have in store for me. After delivering Ghoul, I informed the higher-ups I would need at least a month off, and knowing what they had put me through, they obliged. If anything, they were impressed I had come back in mostly one piece. Those were a few of my targets. I have many more tales to tell, but that will have to wait. I just received my next assignment, and I must begin preparations. If I survive, I will be sure to post more. So, see you soon, hopefully. I'm back, and in one piece this time. Before I talk about more of my targets, I'm going to address a few concerns from my last post. A lot of you are concerned with my bite I suffered from Ghoul. As far as I know, I haven't contracted anything. I was told whatever they did to him shouldn't be contagious, but I made them run tests regardless, all of which came up negative. They did give me some special pills, but I was told these were to help speed up the recovery of my shoulder. It wouldn't surprise me if they were hiding something from me. I just hope that if I do start craving human flesh, I would still have enough mental fortitude to pull the trigger one last time. Good evening, monsieur. I do not believe we have met before. I am Romeo, and you? Monsieur, was that French? I think I almost threw up in my mouth a bit. I guess I should have expected this, though. He has quite the ego after all. It was good to see his charm wasn't working on me, though. I'm not entirely sure why, but I think it may have something to do with my disgust at just how perfect he is. Oh, I'm James. I'm kinda new here. Nice to meet you, Romeo. I managed to respond. James, what a fabulous name, but alone at a party. Unacceptable. Come with me. My friends and I are about to return to my estate. I will show you the finer parts of this city. Is that a sexual reference? Regardless, this was going much better than expected. I was making direct contact with my target. If I went to his home, perhaps I could just wait until everyone else fell asleep and sneak away with Romeo before anyone knew of her. I don't know, we just met. I wouldn't want to impose on you like that, I said, trying to play hard to get. No, I insist you must. Samantha, go with my friend James here and guide him to my home. I will be there shortly. There is someone I must see first. Romeo replied while motioning to one of the women from his group. Samantha did indeed guide me to Romeo's home. I already knew where he lived, of course, but I had to play dumb. Romeo's estate was a true mansion, with aesthetics that would make you think that someone had designed the home in the game The Sims. I was escorted inside. The rest of Romeo's entourage would arrive shortly after. I was offered some scotch that had apparently been aged over 100 years. I'm not much of a drinker, but I accepted it nonetheless. Romeo arrived almost an hour later, fashionably late to his own party. Once he arrived, he immediately approached me. James, follow me. There is something I must show you, he said to me. I didn't hesitate to follow him. This was my chance to be alone with him. I could tranquilize him and be on my way before anyone knew any better. He led me to a room on the other side of the home. The room was something else, something I didn't expect. The walls were covered with pictures, men and women. Each one was of a different person. I think I even noticed a few of them from his group. What is this? I said without even thinking. These are all the people I have conquered, and you are next. Please. Remove your clothing. Romeo said this as he turned his back on me and began to remove his own clothing. I almost felt compelled to remove my own clothing. His words held such power, but I was able to hold out. Instead, I approached him and sunk the tranquil into his neck. I made sure duct tape his mouth. I had heard enough of his words for one night. Romeo was much bigger than me, so it was quite an effort dragging him out his window and back to my vehicle. But I managed to do it before anyone got suspicious. I assume his friends simply thought he was taking his time in conquering me. I dropped off Romeo, and I made sure to shower extra well that night. My experience with Romeo almost made me miss my date with Ghoul. Almost. My next assignment would be another fun one. Codename Kong. What happens when you splice human DNA with gorilla DNA? Well, apparently you get Kong. Personally, I would have preferred the name Caesar in reference to Planet of the Apes, but I suppose he's not a gorilla. And I don't get to pick the names anyway. Kong is essentially a smaller version of Bigfoot. And before you ask if Bigfoot exists, I have to say I don't know. I haven't been tasked with hunting him yet. Kong would be a kill task. There's no guarantee the tranks would work. And if they did, for how long? Not to mention he had killed 2 scientists during his escape. So they weren't too worried about him coming back alive. They just wanted to dissect what was left of him. I was given specific parameters as to avoid the head if at all possible. They mostly wanted to examine the brain, and that wouldn't be possible if I splattered it all on the ground. Another problem I faced was my experience with long-ranged weapons. It had been a part of my training, of course, and I had gotten through the basics. But that was about it. I had been told most of my missions would be up close and personal anyway, so it wasn't that important. Well, it was starting to seem important now. Similar to Ghoul, Kong had taken up residence in a forested area, but since his diet didn't consist of human meat, he had chosen a much more secluded area. I don't think Kong really wanted to hurt anyone. He could have lived his life out in these woods, never bothering anyone. But that's not what the government wanted. My superiors informed me that they had already done overhead sweeps of the area, and were able to tell me exactly where the cave he was staying in was located. Of course, they had done the easy part, and I would get to do all the dirty work on the ground. I made my way to a vantage point overlooking the cave and set up the sniper rifle they had supplied me with. Now all I had to do was wait. After a few hours, Kong finally made his appearance. He walked out of the cave and began to stretch his limbs, the way most of us do after we wake up. I steadied the rifle and aimed the crosshairs over where I would assume his heart was, and I pulled the trigger. I missed. I hadn't taken into account the wind had picked up since I had started waiting, and the bullet had strayed to the right of Kong, hitting the rock of the cave. Kong didn't move though. Instead, he simply turned his gaze to me, with eyes that were all too human. He didn't try to escape. He knew I would come eventually, and if it wasn't me, it would be someone else. Kong had accepted his fate. I had killed the Rippler, of course, but that was different. I had done that while he was asleep. I didn't have to see the look in his eyes before he died. I almost wished Kong had been a monster like Ghoul. That way I wouldn't have to feel bad about putting him down. With a slight hesitation, I reloaded my gun. I took aim, accounting for the wind now, and I fired once again. Bullseye. Kong went down instantly. I made my way over to confirm he was dead, and luckily he was. He wouldn't have to suffer anymore. Kong weighed far too much for me to drag back on my own. Instead, I set off a flare I had been given for this moment, and waited for the air team to come collect him. Sitting next to Kong's lifeless body really made me begin to question my line of work. I had never felt so disgusted in myself, but I knew there was no way out for me. I'm already in far too deep. Perhaps the government has created another monster in me, and someday they'll have to put me down too. But for now, I'm still doing their dirty work. If you'll excuse me. Writing about Kong has really brought my mood down. I'll be back, and I'll be sure to include one of my more exciting assignments next time. But I think I need to lie down for a bit. Until next time, I'm back, and with me I bring a few more of my assignments. I'm not sure how much time I have, so I'll jump right into it. First up, codename Dahlia. Dahlia as well. A doll. A ventriloquist doll to be exact. Despite her simple looks, she's quite dangerous. Probably not in the way that most of you would expect, though. She can't move on her own. Well, she can speak, but that's it. So she won't be running around your home in the middle of the night stabbing people. No. Instead, Dahlia has an incredibly strong power of influence. One look into her eyes, and she'll have complete control of you. It's a bit ironic, really. A ventriloquist doll making humans her puppets. In my briefing, I was told Dahlia is essentially the definition of sadistic. She enjoys making her victims inflict as much pain as possible, before eventually disposing of them. I'm not sure if demons are real, but if they are, I'm sure that's what is trapped in that doll. Dahlia was believed to be staying with a family of 4. She had been taken there by a scientist who had fallen under her control. She had only been gone about a week, but there's no telling what she could have gotten up to in that time. The scientist who had taken her had returned to her workplace a day later and attempted to murder her co-workers, but was quickly taken care of. I made my way to the family's home, hoping to be surprised by what I saw. Let's just say I got my wish, but not in the way I'd hoped. I knocked on the front door. After a few minutes of no response, I turned the handle to find the door was unlocked. I wish I hadn't. The moment I stepped into the home, I was hit with a putrid smell, one that I know means death. The walls were coated in blood. Some of it was dried. Some was fresh and still slowly dripping down. I found the family together in the living room. The mother and 2 children were sat in a small triangle. They were already dead and rotting. Their stomachs had been cut open, with their entrails hanging out. They had been posed in a way to make it look as if they were eating their own organs. In the center of that triangle was the father, hanging from the ceiling. He had scratches and cuts all across him, but that was nothing compared to what had happened to his family. Just before I was about to spill my lunch all over the floor, I heard a voice from the opposite corner of the room. "You're just in time. What do you think of my art? It's a little sloppy, but I'm sure it will get better in time," the voice said. "Dahlia," I questioned. "Oh, well. Have you come to get me already? I was having such a fun time too. Well, I'm done here anyway. I guess you can take me back for now. I'll be out again soon." I made my way over to the voice, making sure to keep my head down. I had no intention of ending up like that family. When I got close, I closed my eyes. I managed to pick her up and flip her over, and made my way back out to my vehicle. "Let me sit up front. I like to have conversations during my car rides. Plus, you can't get much action from women in this line of work, so it will be fun for both of us," Dahlia said mockingly, as much as I wanted to chunk her in the back and throw a blanket or something over her. I also didn't want her to be out of my line of sight, so I granted her wish. I carefully sat her up front, turning her head towards the window. I'd be lying if I said part of me wasn't curious about her. I wanted to know more about what makes a monster. "You should just take me home with you. Tell your boss I wasn't here. I'm sure we could have lots of fun together," Dahlia said. "Yes, I'm sure you would make great kindling for a fire," I responded. Hey, you're funny, I like you. I was thinking I'd have someone kill you eventually, but maybe I'll keep you." "Oh, you don't just kill everyone?" I asked. "Of course not, I like to let the really bad ones live. It's more fun that way," Dahlia said. "What do you mean by that? Are you saying I'm a bad person?" That had made me a bit angry. I had almost turned to look at Dahlia, but I thought better of it. Was she just trying to provoke me? You aren't quite on my level yet, but I see potential in you. You didn't even scream when you saw my work. Maybe you even enjoyed seeing it. You may think we are different, but we really aren't, Dahlia retorted. She was partly right. I hadn't reacted when I saw the bodies. I had felt a little sick, but if I had seen that a few months ago, I would have probably passed out. Whether I like it or not, I am definitely changing, and I don't think it is for the good. What are you? I finally asked after a few minutes of silence. Look into my eyes and I'll tell you. Nice try. I may be stupid, but I'm not that stupid. I responded, almost bursting out into laughter. What are you afraid of? Do you think you would see yourself if you looked into my eyes? That's enough. One more word and I'm Googling where the nearest wood chipper is. Those were the last words I spoke on our little road trip together. I dropped off Dahlia and informed them about the mess at the house. They said they would send someone to clean it up. I was hoping they would give me a break after what I'd seen, but I wouldn't be so lucky. As soon as I turned in Dahlia, they told me they already had a new assignment ready for me. That would be Codename Jack. Grandiose name. I know. This was probably the oddest assignment I had received yet, though. Jack was, from what I could tell, entirely human. I had no clue why I had been tasked with finding a human. Perhaps he was a runaway scientist, or someone who knew too much. But he certainly wasn't what I had gotten used to hunting. I was told Jack was incredibly dangerous, though, and that I shouldn't take any risks in trying to capture him alive. In other words, they wanted him dead. This only made me more curious as to what secrets that Jack must have held. Jack was constantly on the move, so it wasn't easy to find him. But my training had paid off, and I was eventually able to track him down. I watched him for a few. He didn't seem dangerous to me. Suspicious and cautious, yes, but not dangerous. One night he stepped out of his hotel room to go get food, so I decided to let myself in. Jack and I needed to have a talk. Jack didn't seem too surprised when he returned to his room to find me sitting on the couch. He simply held out his arms. So they did send someone for me after all. Well, go ahead and do what you have to. I won't fight it, he said. Sit down, Jack. I just want to talk. Jack raised an eyebrow at this. A curious one, huh? You know what they say about curiosity, right? I rolled my eyes, and once again motioned for Jack to sit down. Who are you, Jack? And why did they send me after you? You don't know? I'm you, or at least I used to be. They tell us where to go, who to kill, who to bring back alive, and we do it. No questions asked. I couldn't handle it anymore, though. So here I am, and here you are, Jack explained. This took me back for a second. I had known he had to have some connection to my agency, but I had never considered he had been in the same position as me. So, there really was no way out. Other than death, that is. I walked across the room, pulled out my gun, and I killed Jack. I had the answers I came here for. Perhaps Dahlia was right. We aren't so different after all. I returned with Jack's body. I wasn't asked to give my usual debriefing. Instead, I was just given a simple nod and told to go home and wait for my next assignment. I wonder if this was another test. If it had been, I'm sure I passed with flying colors. I understand if you all think less of me for the choices I've made, but if it wasn't me, it would be someone else. This was the life I had chosen, or perhaps the life that was chosen for me, regardless. I can't back down now. I'm simply one discardable person in the whole scheme of things. Don't mistake my actions for blind loyalty, though. I know the people I work for aren't good people. I simply know my place in this world. And the minute I stop being useful, I will end up like Jack. How does the saying go, better the devil you know than the devil you don't? I am a cog in a giant machine, and once my cog stops working, I will be discarded and replaced by another. Despite the fact that I risk death every day that I wake up, I have never felt more alive. I no longer have nightmares of those I've killed. I've stopped caring about things like that. If I become too soft, then I will end up like Jack, and I have no intentions of letting that happen. After I disposed of Jack, I was given a week off. It had been a while since I had any time to myself. It was a bit strange. I never had many friends to begin with. and my work had distanced me from the few family members I had kept in touch with. This week off made me realize just how empty my life had become. Was this what they had wanted? Regardless, I was at work the minute my week was up, ready for my next assignment. And I got one. Codename Mimic. As her name implies, Mimic is a master of disguise. She has the ability to morph her face into a perfect replica of anyone she chooses, but she is unable to change her body. I imagine she's still a work in progress. Can you imagine what the government could do if they could create perfect body doubles of anyone they wanted? Mimic had escaped with a few other experiments, but she was the top priority. It was believed that they had all split up, but I was still warned to be on the lookout in case any of them teamed up. Due to her ability, Mimic would be incredibly difficult to locate. Because of this, several hunters like me were given her as an assignment. If our information was correct, then she had not made it out of the city we live in yet. But if she had, we may never find her. The only way we would be able to identify her is by a distinct scar on her left shoulder. The government had set up roadblocks at all of the city's exits while us hunters searched within. 3 other hunters and myself were each given a quadrant to search. Mimic had no family, so she would either have to break into somewhere or find an abandoned location to stay. I spent several hours walking the streets of my quadrant, asking strangers if they had seen a suspicious-looking woman, as well as checking out old decrepit homes that hadn't been lived in years. I found nothing, though. That was until I was approached by a slender, young-looking man, probably early 20s. You would see yourself if you looked into my eyes. That's enough. One more word and I'm Googling where the nearest wood chipper is. Those were the last words I spoke on our little road trip together. I dropped off Dahlia and informed them about the mess at the house. They said they would send someone to clean it up. I was hoping they would give me a break after what I'd seen, but I wouldn't be so lucky. As soon as I turned in Dahlia, they told me they already had a new assignment ready for me. That would be Codename Jack. Grandiose name. I know. This was probably the oddest assignment I had received yet, though. Jack was, from what I could tell, entirely human. I had no clue why I had been tasked with finding a human. Perhaps he was a runaway scientist, or someone who knew too much. But he certainly wasn't what I had gotten used to hunting. I was told Jack was incredibly dangerous, though, and that I shouldn't take any risks in trying to capture him alive. In other words, they wanted him dead. This only made me more curious as to what secrets that Jack must have held. Jack was constantly on the move, so it wasn't easy to find him. But my training had paid off, and I was eventually able to track him down. I watched him for a few. He didn't seem dangerous to me. Suspicious and cautious, yes, but not dangerous. One night he stepped out of his hotel room to go get food, so I decided to let myself in. Jack and I needed to have a talk. Jack didn't seem too surprised when he returned to his room to find me sitting on the couch. He simply held out his arms. So they did send someone for me after all. Well, go ahead and do what you have to. I won't fight it, he said. Sit down, Jack. I just want to talk. Jack raised an eyebrow at this. A curious one, huh? You know what they say about curiosity, right? I rolled my eyes, and once again motioned for Jack to sit down. Who are you, Jack? And why did they send me after you? You don't know? I'm you, or at least I used to be. They tell us where to go, who to kill, who to bring back alive, and we do it. No questions asked. I couldn't handle it anymore, though. So here I am, and here you are. Jack explained. This took me back for a second. I had known he had to have some connection to my agency, but I had never considered he had been in the same position as me. So, there really was no way out. Other than death, that is. I walked across the room, pulled out my gun, and I killed Jack. I had the answers I came here for. Perhaps Dahlia was right. We aren't so different after all. I returned with Jack's body. I wasn't asked to give my usual debriefing. Instead, I was just given a simple nod and told to go home and wait for my next assignment. I wonder if this was another test. If it had been, I'm sure I passed with flying colors. I understand if you all think less of me for the choices I've made, but if it wasn't me, it would be someone else. This was the life I had chosen, or perhaps the life that was chosen for me. Regardless, I can't back down now. I'm simply one discardable person in the whole scheme of things. Don't mistake my actions for blind loyalty, though. I know the people I work for aren't good people. I simply know my place in this world. And the minute I stop being useful, I will end up like Jack. How does the saying go, better the devil you know than the devil you don't? I am a cog in a giant machine. And once my cog stops working, I will be discarded and replaced by another. Despite the fact that I risk death every day that I wake up, I have never felt more alive. I no longer have nightmares of those I've killed. I've stopped caring about things like that. If I become too soft, then I will end up like Jack, and I have no intentions of letting that happen. After I disposed of Jack, I was given a week off. It had been a while since I had any time to myself. It was a bit strange. I never had many friends to begin with, and my work had distanced me from the few family members I had kept in touch with. This week off made me realize just how empty my life had become. Was this what they had wanted? Regardless, I was at work the minute my week was up, ready for my next assignment. And I got one. Codename Mimic. As her name implies, Mimic is a master of disguise. She has the ability to morph her face into a perfect replica of anyone she chooses, but she is unable to change her body. I imagine she's still a work in progress. Can you imagine what the government could do if they could create perfect body doubles of anyone they wanted? Mimic had escaped with a few other experiments, but she was the top priority. It was believed that they had all split up, but I was still warned to be on the lookout in case any of them teamed up. Due to her ability, Mimic would be incredibly difficult to locate. Because of this, several hunters like me were given her as an assignment. If our information was correct, then she had not made it out of the city we live in yet. But if she had, we may never find her. The only way we would be able to identify her is by a distinct scar on her left shoulder. The government had set up roadblocks at all of the city's exits while us hunters searched within. 3 other hunters and myself were each given a quadrant to search. Mimic had no family, so she would either have to break into somewhere or find an abandoned location to stay. I spent several hours walking the streets of my quadrant, asking strangers if they had seen a suspicious-looking woman, as well as checking out old decrepit homes that hadn't been lived in years. I found nothing, though. That was until I was approached by a slender, young-looking man, probably early 20s.